What if a single press conference, less than an hour long, came closer to shattering the Allied command in World War II than weeks of German artillery ever could? What if the greatest threat to victory in the winter of 1945 did not come from Hitler's last gamble in the Ardennes, but from a few carefully chosen words spoken in calm confidence? Tonight on WW2 Silent Valor, we step into that room in Belgium where Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed he was setting the record straight and instead ignited a crisis that reached Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and even Winston Churchill himself. Before we begin, if you value deeply researched World War II stories told with intensity and balance, make sure you like this video and subscribe to WW2 Silent Valor. It helps the channel more than you realize and ensures you never miss a story where history turns not on bullets, but on pride. The date was January 7th, 1945. Snow still covered the shattered forests of Belgium. Graves were fresh. American units were still counting their dead from what would become the bloodiest battle the United States Army ever fought in Europe. At his headquarters, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery summoned reporters against the advice of his own staff. He wore his familiar black beret, the twin badges fixed to it like a signature, calm, composed, certain. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes had been stopped. The maps were slowly straightening. The bulge in the Allied line was shrinking. To Montgomery, this was the moment to explain what had happened, who had stabilized the line, who had restored order when confusion threatened to spread. He believed he was clarifying the record, but history would remember it differently. To understand why that press conference caused such an eruption, we must go back to the morning when the Ardennes first exploded, December 16th, 1944. Before dawn, German artillery tore open the frozen silence. 29 German divisions surged through the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. The objective was desperate and bold: split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, fracture the coalition, and force a negotiated peace in the West before the Soviets crushed Germany from the east. The surprise was nearly complete. Thick fog grounded Allied aircraft. Snow concealed the movement. American divisions holding what was considered a quiet sector were struck in darkness. Some units were still rotating into position when the shells fell. Within 48 hours, the German penetration stretched nearly 60 miles. Regiments were cut off, roads jammed with refugees, supply trucks, and retreating formations tangled in chaos. Command posts lost contact. Radio signals faltered. The front line bent inward like a wound pressed deep into Allied territory. For the United States Army, this would become its largest and bloodiest battle of the war. More than 89,000 casualties over 6 brutal weeks, killed, wounded, missing, frostbitten. By December 20th, the crisis was no longer only about German momentum, it was about geometry. The German salient had split Bradley's 12th Army Group in two. Communications north of the Bulge became unreliable. Telephone lines were severed, radio traffic grew erratic, orders arrived late, if at all. At Supreme Headquarters near Versailles, Eisenhower studied a situation board marked in red. The front was no longer a line, it was an open tier. His responsibility was not pride, it was containment. He made a decision that would stabilize one problem and ignite another. All Allied forces north of the German penetration would temporarily fall under Montgomery's command. That included the American First Army under General Courtney Hodges and the American Ninth Army under General William Simpson, two American field armies removed from Bradley's direct control. Operationally, the logic was sound. Montgomery's headquarters was closer to the northern sector. His communications were intact. He already commanded the British 21st Army Group positioned in that region. Politically, it was explosive. When Eisenhower informed Bradley, the usually restrained American general erupted. Accounts record Bradley warning that he could not answer to the American people if this decision stood. Eisenhower, firm and controlled, reminded him that ultimate responsibility rested with him. The order went out. The alliance held, but a fault line had opened. Montgomery stepped into the northern sector with authority granted by Eisenhower. In his later telling, he found disorder, confusion, a front on the verge of collapse. In American memory, he arrived after the shock, when reinforcements were already thickening the line. The truth lives somewhere between those versions. He imposed structure, he shortened lines, he consolidated positions to form a continuous defensive shoulder along the northern edge of the Bulge. British 30th Corps was placed in reserve behind American units. Artillery coordination improved, defensive belts were clarified, the risk of a sudden German dash to the River Meuse diminished. It was competent, disciplined work. The northern flank stabilized. The line stopped bending, but this was not a cinematic rescue. It was a defensive reorganization amid chaos. Meanwhile, south of the Bulge, something far more aggressive was unfolding. On December 19th, General George S. Patton was already pivoting his Third Army north. His staff had contingency plans ready. Within 72 hours, he disengaged divisions, rotated his entire army 90 degrees in ice and snow, and launched a winter counteroffensive. More than 100 miles of movement under brutal conditions. Icy roads, scarce fuel, blown bridges, yet armored columns pushed forward. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through near Bastogne, relieving the encircled 100, 1st Airborne Division. As skies cleared in early January, Allied air power returned. German supply lines were shredded. Fuel shortages crippled armored spearheads. By January 3rd, 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The German offensive had failed, and that was when Montgomery chose to speak. He believed British contributions had gone unnoticed. He believed his assumption of command had stabilized the northern crisis at a critical hour. His staff urged caution. American commanders were sensitive. The temporary transfer of U.S. armies remained politically raw. They suggested that any public narrative should come from Eisenhower. Montgomery disagreed. January 7th, 1945. The press room filled. Reporters expected charts, figures, measured forecasts. Montgomery began calmly, outlining the German assault and his assumption of Northern command. Then the tone shifted. "The battle has been most interesting," he said, "possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. He described how he got the battle tidy, how he organized American forces, how he positioned reserves. "I took certain steps myself," he explained, "to ensure the Germans would not cross the Meuse." He spoke of deploying British strength deliberately, holding forces back, committing them at decisive moments. He concluded by painting a picture of British troops fighting on both sides of American forces who had suffered a hard blow. In the room, American correspondents stiffened. The implication was unmistakable. The Americans had faltered. The British had restored order. The British press embraced the narrative immediately. Headlines suggested Montgomery had cleared up the mess. British readers, weary after years of war and sensitive to American dominance, welcomed the image of British leadership at a decisive moment. The American reaction was volcanic. Stars and Stripes criticized the tone sharply. Americans, soldiers who had endured the frozen forests of the Ardennes, read the accounts with anger. They remembered Bastogne. They remembered holding crossroads in blinding snow. They remembered bleeding without air support. And now, in print, it seemed someone else was claiming the rescue. Bradley did not shout. He drafted a resignation letter. He could not command American armies publicly diminished by an Allied superior. Senior officers quietly supported him. If Bradley resigned, others might follow. The structure under Eisenhower could fracture. When Eisenhower learned of the draft, he grasped the scale of the danger. This was no longer about personality. It was about coalition survival. He asked Bradley for 48 hours, and then he turned to Montgomery. The conversation was controlled, but tense. Eisenhower explained the reaction, the emphasis on "I handled," the perception that American achievements, especially Patton's winter counterstroke, had been minimized. Montgomery was reportedly surprised. He insisted he meant praise. He believed he had described a strong Allied picture, but he did not hear what others heard. In London, Churchill understood instantly. He had spent 5 years preserving the Anglo-American alliance. He knew how fragile it could be. On January 18, 1945, he rose in the House of Commons. Every sentence was measured. He praised the victory, but made it unmistakably clear that the Battle of the Bulge had been overwhelmingly an American fight. American armies bore the shock. American losses dwarfed British casualties. He underlined it publicly. It was diplomacy in full view of the world. The message crossed the Atlantic. Britain recognized the American burden. The alliance steadied. 3 days later, Montgomery issued a clarification. It was not an apology. He expressed admiration for American soldiers and devotion to Eisenhower's leadership, but he did not concede that tone and ownership mattered. For many Americans, it confirmed the problem. Eisenhower met Bradley again. Churchill's speech had helped. Montgomery's clarification had been delivered. Bradley set conditions. Montgomery would never again command American forces except in extreme emergency. Eisenhower personally would retain direct control of the advance into Germany. Eisenhower agreed. The resignation was withdrawn. The alliance held, but something had changed. Bradley avoided direct dealings with Montgomery unless Eisenhower was present. Patton turned Montgomery into a target of sharp humor. Cooperation became formal, procedural, cautious. Historians would later weigh Montgomery's claims carefully. Yes, he stabilized the northern shoulder. Yes, he imposed order in crisis. But decisive elements lay elsewhere, in the endurance of American infantry during the initial shock, in Baston's resistance, in Patton's pivot, in the return of air power that strangled German supply. Montgomery helped hold the line. He did not win the battle. And that distinction mattered deeply because beneath the tactical debate lay something structural. Britain brought experience and seasoned leadership. America brought scale, manpower, industrial power capable of ending the war. Britain feared being eclipsed. America feared being patronized. Montgomery's words gave voice to both anxieties. The press conference lasted less than an hour. Its consequences lasted months. Nazi Germany would collapse that spring. The Allied armies would cross the Rhine and drive into the heart of the Reich. The coalition survived, but it was never effortless again. Montgomery never fully grasped why the reaction had been so intense. In his memoirs, he continued to frame the Ardennes as a moment of decisive personal leadership. To him, criticism was oversensitivity. History has been more measured. Modern scholars describe his role as capable, stabilizing, limited. Eisenhower's true achievement was not brilliance on a battlefield. It was preserving unity when pride threatened to unravel it. On January 7th, 1945, no artillery fired in the Belgian headquarters, no tanks moved, no aircraft roared overhead, only words. Yet those words nearly fractured the command structure of the most powerful alliance in history. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments, was Montgomery misunderstood or did he let ego override coalition discipline? And share this video with someone who believes World War II was decided only by guns and tanks. Sometimes it was decided by tone. This is WW2 Silent Valor, where we don't just revisit battles, we examine the fragile alliances that made victory possible.